she said, "What is going on? It seems like Mum's completely out of it." To which Martin then responded, "Oh, I might have given her a little too much medication."
Just a quick disclaimer, the content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, crime scenes and other disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised.
This episode is sponsored by Think Forensic.
Think Forensic are a one-stop shop for all things forensic science and crime solving. They hold experience days, as well as corporate events, team building events, and general education for primary school right the way up to university level, as well as other events and consultancy. There's also a shop where you can get your hands on all things crime solving, from evidence gathering to packaging and collecting evidence, as well as other forensic science equipment.
For more information or to book on an experience day, please visit the website. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Grave Secrets. We're your hosts. I'm Annie.
And I'm Beth. Today we've got a case study for you. This, I think, without a doubt, goes to show the unbreakable bond of mother and daughter.
Yeah, I thought that straight away with this one.
Like, to an incredible degree.
Yeah.
I think family bond in general, because there are multiple daughters in this case. But again, just the tenacity and sheer determination of family members that meant that ultimately the case was solved.
Yeah. Was this the one that you spoke about before, that you mentioned briefly that you'd been listening to? I think you'd watched something on it or you'd listened to something.
Yeah.
I thought it was. As I was doing the research, I thought, I'm sure this is the one that you'd mentioned.
This is one of those cases where I've listened to it on another podcast and then I've gone, oh my God, that is crazy. And then just told you about it as in a, can you believe that someone would do this?
Yeah.
And then thought, well, it'd be a really good one to cover.
And it was actually,
detail.
As I was researching it, I did find this one really interesting.
Yeah. So, as I say, this is a case that from the off wasn't taken seriously and was actually ruled an accident.
Yeah.
So it was only due to that determination that the case was ever solved. Otherwise, we might have covered it, but as an unsolved case. So the case shows the calculated and manipulative actions of basically one offender that would do anything to get what they wanted.
It's quite scary when, as we go through this and we unravel what happened, it's very scary at how cold it is in general, I found.
Definitely. So today we are talking about the murder of Michele MacNeill. We're going to give you a bit of a backstory to Michelle's life, and then we are going to work chronologically, talking you through the events which ultimately led to her death.
So Michele MacNeill is who we're going to be talking about today, and this case took place in Utah, so we've got a American case for you again.
It was actually Pleasantville, wasn't it?
Oh, was it? I didn't see that.
Pleasantville,
that's nice.
Utah. And again, I always think when it's something like that,
it's like I picture it in my head just being so lovely with all the green grass out of the front and flowers everywhere, like something off Desperate Housewives.
Yeah, Desperate Housewives, or if anyone's ever watched Sweet Magnolias, which is a guilty pleasure.
Oh no, I haven't watched that one. No.
It's got Britney Spears' sister in it.
Oh, was it?
Yeah. Anyway.
Oh, don't get me started on these because I'll end up going home and end up watching these. But yeah, it sounds like a quite a nice place to live, doesn't it? So Michelle's maiden name was actually Michele Summers. If we take it all the way back to sort of her growing up, she was really popular in school. She was athletic. She was a really good student. She was actually a straight A student, and she played the violin as well.
What I found amazing as well is, again, just her forethought at that age. So she was incredibly beautiful.
She was, yeah.
And obviously she'd have had people telling her that, I'm sure, but she decided that because she was dead cert that she wanted to become a doctor or something of a similar ilk, she knew she wanted to go to college, so started entering beauty pageants to be able to fund her way through like school and college.
It's crazy. She's thought about it from like so far back, didn't she? She actually got voted Miss Concord. She got homecoming queen. She was a cheerleader. She did modelling on the side.
Yeah.
So it's like she'd sort of got the full package, really, hadn't she? Doing all the beauty stuff. And then she was also a straight A student and playing the violin.
And then she got a scholarship, and that scholarship money basically put her through, again, school and college, but then also went to study in Switzerland.
Right.
And so she did like a, exchange program in Switzerland. And was fluent in French. Like, she just sounds like she
could do it all
figured out. Yeah.
She could do it all.
And again, what's that? Like early 20s?
Yeah.
She's just got it all sorted.
Well, it weren't even early 20s, was it? I think it was even before that, so maybe late teens.
Yeah.
Because it said then she did get involved in the Mormon church.
Yes.
So that
the
became
Latter
a big
Day
part of her
Saints
life.
church. And again, at this stage, if you are from a religious upbringing, or maybe that you are more heavily involved in a religion like that, the next thing that everyone would think about is family.
Yeah.
And at what stage you're going to settle down. And she, again, almost fell into the next stage of her life rather perfectly in her early 20s.
She actually went to a singles dating event, didn't she? And that's where she met a guy called Martin, Martin MacNeill. And I think things quite quickly advanced between them. And a lot of people had said that Michele had always wanted that sort of home, family life. And stability. She wanted to be a wife. She wanted to be a mother. And it just was going smoothly at this point.
And he sounded quite impressive from the off.
Yeah.
You can imagine that she'd have been kind of swept off her feet.
Yeah.
Photos of them together, they look like a really nice couple. They look like they'd have probably won homecoming king and queen together.
Yeah.
But equally, he at that stage was a couple of years older, and he had already served in the military. He was out but had received honourable discharge. So again, that was probably lovely to know that you've got like a man that's been in the military, because that again is quite an all-American thing.
Yeah.
But then also I would assume nice to know that he's not going to get sent back out there again.
Yeah.
And again, he was training as a doctor. So they'd probably got similar interests.
Yeah.
You know that then he's going to be successful.
And he's probably going to be stable as well. I think when you're looking at someone as a woman who you want to settle down and have a family with, that stable home life is appealing, isn't it? And at this time, she's still only 21.
Yeah.
So she's now in her early 20s and everything's sort of panned out for her.
And she really ran with that, because within 4 months of them dating, they actually went and eloped and got married.
Yeah.
And they ended up then having 4 children over a 5-year period, didn't they? So again, it was just all working out completely as she probably...
It was, and they just started a family really quick, didn't they?
Yeah.
Met each other, got married, started the family, and it's like, from the outside looking in, probably looks like the perfect life.
Yeah. So the 4 children were Rachel, Vanessa, Alexis and Damien. And again, there was just a 5-year gap between those.
Yeah, I think all the kids were quite close as well because of that age gap.
Yeah.
Because if you're all the same age, basically, aren't you?
Yeah.
Then I feel like you would be a bit closer.
Yeah, you're going through it all at the same time, aren't you?
Yeah.
And as they then got a little bit older, again, it sounds like Michele absolutely loved being a mother, and that was kind of her calling.
She wanted to care for people, didn't she? I got like a really caring vibe from her. She just wanted to look after people.
Yeah. And even when they're not necessarily kind of her own family.
Yeah.
It sounds like even within the church, she saw them as her family as well. And so ultimately, as her 4 children got a little bit older, they decided that they were going to adopt. And they'd actually gone out to the Ukraine and was at an orphanage there. And the plan was to just adopt 1 child. But Alexis, I think, who was the 3rd child, Alexis says that she spoke to her mum, and her mum was in floods of tears over the phone.
Aww.
And her mum said, "I can't do it. I can't
just
leave
bring
them here.
one."
There's so many children here." So they ended up actually adopting Elle and Sabrina. So they then had, so that's 4, 5, 6 children.
Yep.
And then on top of that, one of her daughters, so her granddaughter, so Vanessa had a little girl called Ada, and they actually raised Ada. So then they've got 7 children, effectively, that they're raising within their household. And probably familiar to an extent. She'd come from a large family herself.
Yeah.
She'd got 3 brothers and 3 sisters. They were actually all raised in California. But she was familiar with probably the chaos that comes with a big family.
Yeah, is what I liked as well is that when I watched the children doing interviews, they said like how nice of a home life and upbringing they had. That it was a really great childhood, that the mum and dad were amazing parents.
Yeah.
And it was just really nice to hear that with a massive family as well. And she's so young still, isn't she?
Yeah.
Like, I bet by the time she was my age, she'd had like all of the kids.
Yeah, which is just crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, and I wouldn't even be able to cope with one.
And she still looked glam.
Yeah, and she did, didn't she? She always looked really nice. She was absolutely stunning, and I feel like she'd always got like her hair and makeup really nice. She was always dressed nice, wasn't she? In any of the videos that we saw of her, she always looked lovely.
So again, for all intents and purposes, they have got the life they always wanted together. But as the years went on, I would assume, like in most relationships, you hit a few bumps along the way.
Yeah.
And it appears that by around 2007, I think Michele was feeling like she was maybe getting a bit neglected by her husband, or that Martin wasn't necessarily finding her as attractive anymore. Yeah. Again, when you're looking after that many kids, you don't, although she did seem to dress up and look nice, you've probably not got a lot of time for date nights and things like that.
Yeah, and to do stuff for yourself.
Quality time.
Yeah.
So it sounds like there was a little bit of distance within the marriage.
Yeah.
And in March time, that's when Martin decided that he'd got a good idea for her to feel better about herself and gain some confidence. And his idea, or his suggestion to Michele, was that she have a facelift.
Yeah, and not just like a little bit of, like a bit of Botox here and there to just lift up or, get rid of a few wrinkles, a full facelift. And at this point as well, Martin had gone on a bit of a health spree himself. He'd started going to the gym a lot. He'd lost a bit of weight. He was sort of trying to make himself look really good.
Yes.
And I feel like that's another thing that Michele thought, oh, well, if he's doing it, I probably should do it as well. He's taking time to care for himself and make sure he looks good. And now I need to make sure that I still look good, which you shouldn't have to.
I know. But on that as well, so Martin suggested that this would be a lovely idea, offered to pay for it all, and said that it was what she needed to make herself feel better. But again, the children,
how can he tell her that she needs that to make herself feel better?
Beyond belief.
It's not like she's asked for it and he said, yeah, you know what, I know you really want it, I'll pay for it for you as like a present or whatever. And even the kids said she'd never asked for it. She never spoke about it.
Not even like Botox or like smaller cosmetic
or like
surgeries.
fillers.
She'd never been interested in any of it. And then all of a sudden he's like, no, let's go for this.
It's an extreme measure to go from nothing to a full facelift.
And generally speaking, now I may be wrong, but generally speaking, I would have thought, because it's a major surgery, that your husband would kind of be on the opposite end of the spectrum. Like, oh, I'm really not sure if this is a good idea. It's a major surgery.
We want you to be safe.
You're going to be ill. It's unnecessary. You've got the kids. Do you know what I mean? Like, let's not take that risk. And she'd actually said that if she was going to do it, because it sounds like she was persuaded by Martin to go through with it, but she did say, if I do this, I want to lose some weight first so that I'm healthier going into the surgery.
Yeah.
And she already knew that she got quite high blood pressure. So she said, I want to get that under control. before
which is
I
all
go
sensible and
into
all
surgery.
very reasonable. And then the next step would be for that, if she had decided that she wanted to do it, is sit down and search and look for your surgeons, talk to a few different people, get like reviews, talk to people who had the surgery done, and just dig into it. But it doesn't seem like there was any of that. It was almost like Martin was a doctor, so he knew best and he wanted to choose who did the surgery and he knew where to go, and that was sort of it, wasn't it? I don't feel like Melissa had a choice.
No, and interestingly, because apparently Martin did have connections, they travelled over an hour and a half away to a cosmetic surgeon that no one knew. Right. Rather than going somewhere local where they would have had those recommendations, which seemed like an odd choice. But ultimately, Michele agreed, and she'd actually asked her daughter, Alexis, that we mentioned earlier, to come with her for one of the pre-op appointments. Martin was there as well, so it was Martin, Michele and Alexis, and they'd gone just to talk through the kind of particulars of the surgery.
Yeah, and because the daughter, Alexis, was actually studying in medical school, she'd have a bit of an idea of what was going on and be able to advise. Michele probably thought Alexis would be able to advise along with Martin, and they'd be able to come to the best decision.
You've got the two best people, haven't you, on your side. And Alexis was actually studying in Las Vegas at medical school, so she'd come back. It sounds like she kind of went home quite often, back to Utah.
Yeah.
But she was there for this consultancy. And at this stage, Alexis recalls that her father was quite brash, and she thought that he was just trying to show off because he was being really specific about certain details of the surgery. And the one thing that he made a point of was what drugs should be prescribed to his wife. And the doctor had even said that they were a lot stronger than what the surgeon would usually prescribe.
Yeah.
But he had kind of given this list and said, no, this is what I think you should prescribe.
And the thing is, if your husband's a doctor, you probably trust his opinion on it. And Martin had also said, oh, no, they won't all be taken together. I'm going to be there looking after her. Like, nothing could go wrong. I will be there all the time. I'll be administering the medication. So I'll make sure that nothing gets sort of mixed up and confused.
Again, there is a difference between a doctor and a surgeon, though. Do you know what I mean? Like,
was Martin a physician?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's never actually conducted surgery, and yet he's the one that's like, no, listen here, surgeon.
Yeah, listen to me.
I'll tell you what drugs we should prescribe. But the thing is,
Martin was quite like that, wasn't he? He'd got a big ego. He was very brash.
Yeah.
People had said, every person who would listen, he would say, I'm a doctor.
Yeah.
It's almost like he needed everyone to know. And he needed that validation, didn't he, from other people. And he sort of looked down on others that weren't doctors or of his profession.
Yeah.
So I can just imagine him going in to the surgeon and saying all this with his little list from the way that people have described him.
Yeah, definitely. The surgery went ahead, and as planned, everything went well.
Yep.
Michele came out of hospital the following day. I think they'd kept her in overnight just to check everything was fine, but she came out the following day. And Alexis had actually said to her mother that she was going to stay and be with her for that recovery process. Again, it's a major surgery. Alexis was training, and she said she wanted to treat her mum like any other patient that she'd have, and was very meticulous about that care and that level of care.
The thing is, though, that Alexis had actually said to her dad just before the surgery went ahead, or when they were booking it, can we wait until summer? Because then I know that I'll be in the summer holidays and I can be there every single day to care for her. And her dad was like, so blasé. And he was like, nope, we're going ahead with it. And it was really quick, wasn't it? From having the consultations, it was like within weeks she was in and having the surgery. And Alexis said she was a bit annoyed because she wanted to be there the whole time.
Yeah.
But with the timings that it worked out, she would then be there for a part of the time, but then have to go back to medical school to do training.
And for just such a huge decision in general, for someone that's not been talking about it for years on and off, for it just to come out of nowhere and then within a matter of weeks you've gone through with it, is huge, isn't it?
Yep.
So Alexis did stay with her mum. that first night that she was back home. But then again, her father became insistent that he would look after her and that she should go home and that Alexis could come back the following evening.
And you'd think nothing of that because it's your dad at this point, isn't it?
Yeah, and Alexis said like she'd not really had much sleep because obviously you're probably waking your mum up every like 4 hours maybe
to make sure she's got medication
and whatever. And she was helping her go to the toilet, things like that.
Yeah.
Your face is that bandaged that you probably can't see properly.
Yeah, they said the bandages were like almost covering both of her eyes. She had really limited vision.
Yeah.
I think one of her eyes was completely covered. So it's hard to do anything, even in a familiar surrounding, isn't it?
Yeah. And so Alexis, again, super committed to her mum's care, came back about 6 o'clock the following morning. So she'd gone, had some rest, and then come back 6 o'clock and checked on her mum, as you would do, straight in there. And she said it just seemed odd because her mum sent that out of it, that it was as if she was unconscious and drugged up rather than just sleeping.
And it's not that long ago since Alexis had left her. So for her to be for Alexis to have left and her mum be perfectly fine, and you know, sort of coherent and recovering as well as she could from the surgery, to then probably like less than 12 hours later for her to be then fully dosed
comatose
up. It's odd situation.
Yeah. So she said that to her dad, and she said, "What is going on? It seems like mum's completely out of it." To which Martin then responded, "Oh, I might have given her a little too much medication." So Alexis started at this stage being a little bit suspicious. Obviously, there are elements of this whole kind of charade that have been odd.
Yeah.
But then at that stage, you're like, well, how could you make such a mistake when you were the one that knew what drugs you was the one that administered? Yeah, you're the doctor. I'm still in medical school and I've not had this hiccup.
Yeah,
like what's causing this?
It's worrying. And at one point, it even said to Alexis, "Oh, your mum's thrown up and she's thrown up the medication, so I've had to give her more." But we don't actually know if she did throw up or if, you know, he just gave her too much. Yeah.
So Alexis at that point was like, right, okay, I'm going to stay. And did then continue to look after her mum for the following few weeks. Her mum was recovering really well. She said it got to the stage where she'd managed to whittle it down to just the like pain meds, but only kind of light pain meds like our ibuprofen type medication rather than any of the serious drugs, because Michele didn't like being on them. She said it made her feel sick, and so she didn't want to be on anything stronger.
Yeah.
And Alexis then was happy with the progress that her mum was making. They'd taken the bandages off. Michele had started doing little bits to look after the kids again. They'd been out in the car, she'd driven. And Alexis then had to go back to Las Vegas. And she said that the night before she went back, they actually went out for dinner. So again, at that stage, you'd be completely happy with how everything's going.
Yeah, because she's basically not like made a full recovery, but she's recovered enough to get up, go out and do stuff, leave the house, look after the kids. That's as good as you're going to get after surgery, isn't it?
Absolutely.
For the time being.
Yeah, yeah. So Alexis felt happy that her mum was kind of on the road to recovery, and so headed back to medical school. And she'd only actually been back a day, and she spoke to her mum again early in the morning at about 9:15.
She's rang to check in on her already when she's literally just got back.
Just to see how her mum's getting on. And her mum says, "Yeah, don't worry about me. I'm doing well." So that's that. So Alexis goes into a lecture, and when she comes out of that lecture, she has got a voicemail from her dad. So she listens to the voicemail, and again, this was at about 9:10. He'd left the voicemail, but obviously Alexis got to it a little bit later. But in this voicemail, her dad sounds frustrated. I wouldn't say angry as such, but frustrated. No. And he's basically saying, "You need to speak to your mother, Alexis, because she's not listening to me. She's getting out of bed. She's trying to do too much. and she's not listening to me, and I'm worried about her. So Alexis thinks, right, okay, well, I've just spoken to Mum and everything sounded all right.
She's absolutely fine. Yeah.
But I'll give them a ring back later. And then in the next phone call with the father, because again, back into a lecture, comes out, tries to give her father a ring, he then stated that Michele, Alexis's mother, was in the bathtub and that she had drowned and that she was unconscious.
But then he left this in a voicemail, but then he just hung up. Like, how could you tell your child something like that over a voicemail?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you ring the police and get the police to go and get her from Las Vegas Medical School, bring her out, make sure she's somewhere that she's looked after, and then tell her or get her to fly back? It's just ridiculous.
And it's, because not only is it your mother that you'd be hearing about, but from your father, you'd think that there would be a more personal.
Yeah, and she spoke to her mum that day as well. So you'd be so confused by this. And by now, this is the 11th of April 2007. And you just think, what an odd situation. What an odd scenario.
And Alexis just, again, was completely perplexed as to what's going on. She said she'd got a complete sinking feeling, just dropped all of her stuff in the uni.
Yeah.
And then just left for the next flight to get back. And that is effectively when everything began to unravel. By the time Alexis had got back, quite a lot had happened. But the first thing that she noted was that she was trying to find this book of notes that she'd made regarding her mum's medication, and her father just said, don't worry, the police have taken it. But again, she's suspicious.
Now she's suspicious, isn't she?
Yeah.
So if we talk about what actually happened that day. So Martin went into work in the morning, as usual. He picked Ada up from school and he got home at about 11:35 a.m. So nothing out of the ordinary. He'd done his normal sort of routine. Then he'd said to Ada, who was one of the smaller children, wasn't she?
She was the youngest, so she was the one that was Vanessa's daughter there.
Yeah, I don't know how old she was.
No, I couldn't place an age, but based on the photo that they showed of her from the time, she looked no more than 2 or 3, I would say.
Right, okay, I thought she was maybe a little bit older, but I couldn't, like I said, I couldn't really tell. So he'd actually said to Ada, go in and check on your mum, and check that your mum's all right, go and say hello to her. And he actually stayed in the kitchen. So Ada had then gone, she'd gone into the bathroom, and she had actually found her mum, Michele, well, it wasn't a mum, was it? A grandma. Michele actually dead in the bath. So she screamed, and you can just imagine like how horrific that will have been for that little girl. And now she's screaming for her.
I also think for her to know at such a young age that there's something wrong, and it's not just like
she's fallen asleep. I thought that, yeah,
is significant. And what we'll talk about in a minute will make sense in terms of why you wouldn't just think that she'd fallen asleep in the bath.
Yeah.
But effectively then Ada obviously screams, runs into the kitchen, and recalls or told the police officers later on that she'd like dragged Martin into where Michele was. And at that point, then Utah police, the dispatch centre, receive a 911 call that a woman had been found in her bathtub unresponsive. And this was actually Martin MacNeill that placed the call.
Yeah, did you listen to the 911 call?
Yes.
What did you think to it?
He sounded angry, and I do understand that some people have that reaction because they are frustrated, and it's like everything now. I want everything now to fix it.
Yeah, help now sort of thing, yeah.
However, the way that he then communicated with the dispatcher didn't allow for any of that help.
I thought it was quite arrogant the way he was towards the dispatcher. It was almost like, I'm a doctor, you're a dispatcher, what do you know? I'll do what I want.
Yeah.
But then, like, you've obviously rang for help.
Yeah.
So you need some sort of help.
He wasn't giving any clear answers. So,
No.
for example, the dispatcher would say, like, is she breathing? And he was like, I'm a doctor. I know what I'm doing. You need to get someone here now. So, again, the dispatcher would kind of say, like, yeah, we've got people on their way, but then ask to confirm the address of the location. And he wouldn't provide it. And you'd think, again, that you'd want to make that abundantly clear.
That'd be the first thing. 'Cause you want to make sure they come to your address and not
if
anyone
anything,
else's.
you'd be, like, repeating it more clearly if you're going to be a bit arsey.
Yeah.
So that they've got it. But he kind of didn't give any clear address. He wasn't answering simple questions. He'd actually hung up on the dispatcher.
I can't believe he hung up. That when he put the phone down and I was listening to the call, I was like, has he actually just hung up on her?
And then they get back through to him, and again, on with the dispatcher. They ask if his wife is breathing, and he shouts, yes, I'm doing CPR. And then again, just hangs
says,
up. And
I'm a physician.
And it's right as she says, okay, sir, don't and then he literally hangs up
again, yeah.
And you just, again, it just doesn't make sense. You might say, like, I'm going to put you down on speakerphone or whatever and I'm going to do CPR.
Yeah.
But he didn't. He just hung up.
So at 11:48 was when the police and the ambulance were called, and Ada actually went next door and told the neighbours and got some help. So they came round and they helped get Michele out of the bath.
But I found that interesting as well because originally it was 2 female neighbours that went over to help. And when they went into the bathroom and Martin was there, they said, Martin, how can we help? Do you want us to help you lift Michele out of the bathtub? And he said, no, I need a man's help.
Obviously.
Yeah. So again, it's just like this complete disregard for anyone that is actually trying to assist.
Yeah.
But at that stage, then a third neighbour, he was called Doug Daniels, he did come, helped get Michele out of the bath, and he was giving Michele chest compressions whilst Martin, her husband, was then giving her mouth-to-mouth. But that seemed odd because Doug recalled that as he was providing chest compressions, there was like mucus around Michele's mouth, obviously from where she had drowned, but that this mucus wasn't transferring to Martin at all. Like he wasn't as messy almost.
So he wasn't
as he
touching
should
her.
have been.
He wasn't touching her and doing it
actually
properly.
effectively giving mouth to mouth, which very basic first aid training would teach you how to do mouth to mouth. So if you're a doctor, you would absolutely know how to do it successfully.
Yeah.
And for someone that's just a neighbour to recognise that it wasn't right, just rings massive alarm bells. So Ada at this point is obviously being looked after by the neighbours, and then the police officers are just trying to get a brief idea from her as to what had happened. And she actually said that her mother had got clothes on. So she, from what I could gather, was dressed from the top half, but didn't have any trousers on.
Okay.
Pants, they referred to them as.
Yeah.
But, so she'd not got any trousers on. But that effectively she was like hunched over in the water. Ada actually described it as being a muddy brown colour, which was then consistent with there being blood in the water. But that had said that her mum's face was partially out of the water, but her hair was fully in the water.
Right.
So that's what she described. And again, the 2 female neighbours that were pretty much first on scene as an outsider, they backed up what Ada had said and said that that's what they'd seen as they'd walked into it as well.
It's just horrible for a child to witness something like that, and you just think that will have stayed with her, that image of a mom, grandma, for the rest of her life.
And I also think that it's not just that initial shock and that image, but it's then all the chaos around you. You've just got so many strangers that have descended. It sounds like Martin, again we'll talk about in a second, was acting really chaotically and really angrily So you've got that, then you've got all of these strangers, then you've got medics, and if she saw any of what they were doing to her mum, I mean, seeing someone get chest compressions is really jarring to witness. And she's, you know, a super young child.
Yeah.
So I mentioned that Martin's behaviour was odd. When the medics had arrived on scene, obviously they were then conducting life-saving measures to try and save Michele. But Martin was kind of trying to get in the way of that and like pressing down on Michele's chest almost. So they'd pulled him away and told him to like back off and let them help. But he was shouting at them like, save her life, but in an angry manner. And it actually made the medics become uncomfortable and distracted so that they couldn't do their job. So officers had to remove him from the home.
Yeah, they said he was having like outbursts. Like 1 minute he'd be all right and calm, and then next minute he'd be shouting and screaming, and the next minute he'd be calm again, and then it was almost like he'd remember and think, oh, I need to say something now, and then start acting hysterical again.
Yeah. Again, medics knew that Michele's lungs had been full of water because as they started doing chest compressions and mouth to mouth, she did actually expel some of this water, which again was like this muddy brown colour, which went to show that she had drowned.
Yeah, and it went to show that he'd not done it right the first time round.
Yeah, because apparently she did like pink up a bit like you would expect to see when someone has had chest compressions.
And then it makes you think at this point, if he would have done the chest compressions and the mouth-to-mouth properly...
How much time it would have saved.
If she maybe would have survived.
Yeah, absolutely. So Martin is obviously being questioned by the medics that were there and the officers as to what had happened, how he'd found her. And he just kept providing slightly different stories or theories as to what might have happened. To one of the officers, he'd mentioned that it was likely that she'd just taken too many tablets and that she'd fallen and hit her head. To someone else, she'd said that it looked like she'd drowned, but he mentioned that she'd actually had her feet out of the water and her head in the water, which again was significant because this isn't how anyone else stated that she'd been found. He then said that he thought that she might have just fallen asleep, and it was just odd that rather than focusing on even his daughter or his wife and the updates, he was just theorising as to what had actually happened.
Yeah.
You kind of think past that, don't you? It doesn't matter what's happened.
Yeah.
It's just how we fix it.
And it's everyone, all the witnesses link in and they're all saying the same thing. And then he's just like, over here, random on his own, like saying something completely different.
And he was also talking about how religious he was. So apparently he was making statements about how the Lord would not forgive him, but it was something along the lines of like how the Lord would get him through or understand or something. Right. It wasn't like he was praying for Michele, but it was like he was boasting about, again, this... I'm righteous, I'm religious.
And God will protect me.
Yeah. It was odd. Or, you know, officers noted that it seemed strange.
Yeah.
So Michele was taken to American Fork Hospital and they worked on her, but quite quickly realised that she was deceased at that point. One of the crucial elements that made medics realise this is because they actually noted that lividity had already set in on like her underside, and again that tends to take about half an hour before lividity would even begin to set in, so they knew that it was way past the point that she could be saved. However, this didn't make a blind bit of difference to Martin, because he came storming into the hospital telling them, keep working on her, save my wife, you must save Michele, but then really strangely offered the doctors $10,000 to just keep working on her incessantly. So, they will have said, I'm really sorry, but your wife has gone.
And he said, here's 10 grand.
But carry on for as long as it takes, but here's 10 grand. You just think, what what world would
What
that...
goes through your head to offer extra money? It's crazy, isn't it?
They'd also said that her lips were blue as well,
right?
Which again is a sign that she's drowned, but it's too late to save her.
Yeah, and I think her family in this case, while all this is going on, Alexis straight away had some sort of suspicions, didn't she, from the off, really. And she confided in her sister Rachel, and she said that she thought her dad may have got something to do with the death of her mum, which is such a hard thing to say, because, you know, if you've all got a good relationship with your dad up to this point...
Yeah.
How horrible if you're wrong.
Yeah,
to blame your
absolutely.
dad.
And also to kind of just come out with it at that stage, you'd be like, why are you saying this now? Like, this isn't what we should be concentrating on. But obviously that's how real this kind of threat was to Alexis.
Yeah.
Because she felt like it had to be said there and then.
And I feel like she was the one who was probably around the most during this time.
Yes.
So during
during
the recovery, during the surgery, she was the one that had actually been there.
Yeah.
And I think that Rachel sort of took it quite well, and that just shows what sort of a person Alexis is. I don't think she was a person to start just saying random things without proof. And if she had said that, I think Rachel probably thought, well, let's hear her out and see what evidence she's got to back it up, and let's see if we can get to the bottom of it. And then either way, we know.
Yeah. So officers did then return to the scene, to the bathroom, and they conducted a brief search, but didn't really find anything untoward that would suggest that this was nothing but an accidental drowning. Again, there was water around the bath, and there were a few kind of photos of the scene, but they didn't appear to have reason, again, to call this an investigation or to start an investigation. So Doug Daniels, the neighbour, was actually asked to tidy up so that the family didn't have to do it. And he recalled finding bloody and wet towels. He also mentioned that he'd found just a couple of items of clothing, and then another family member actually found the rest of Michelle's clothes that she was believed to have been wearing. But the trousers were never found. These pants were never found.
Right.
So although it didn't look untoward, they did have enough reason to conduct an autopsy. And that was probably potentially because she had surgery relatively recently. So they did conduct an autopsy, but ultimately that again ruled the death as accidental, but due to cardiovascular disease. So natural causes. But Michele was only 50 years old.
Yeah, and she didn't actually have major issues, did she? It wasn't like there was stuff that she knew about. We mentioned earlier high cholesterol?
Yeah,
blood
pressure, yeah.
So she'd had some problems with high blood pressure, but nothing as significant as like heart problems or anything like that. So it did seem strange. She wasn't an unfit person. Like you said, she's in her 50s, which is...
Yeah.
No age to...
Yeah, young, fit and healthy. It just didn't make sense. So at this stage, obviously, all of the family are grieving, and Alexis is grieving, but she also now has real suspicions and real kind of wariness of her father's behaviour. And one of the reasons that we've not yet mentioned was that in the kind of year or so before her mother's now death, her mum had actually confided in Alexis and said that she did believe that Martin was having affairs, and that even if it wasn't a full-blown affair, he was definitely sleeping with other people.
There was something going on, and she sort of knew. It was an instinct, weren't it? And she'd confided in Alexis about quite a few things, hadn't she, along with this. And when she'd told Alexis about that she thought that Martin was having an affair, Alexis thought, well, how do we sort of find out about this, and she'd actually gone to the lengths now, knowing what she did, of digging into her dad's phone records.
Yeah.
So for her to take that upon herself while she's still grieving for a mom, so she managed to get the phone records, didn't she? And they looked at the numbers that were called, and there was one number that he'd been calling a lot.
And in the middle of the night.
Yes. And they actually found out that this number belonged to someone called Gypsy Gillian Willis. So obviously that name had then stuck in Alexa's head. It's quite a distinctive name as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and she'd kind of got no idea. But again, she said that, like, even if you were to speak to her dad about it, he just had really good excuses for everything. So he'd have come up with a reasoning that would have made sense to a degree, that would have kind of just quashed any further questions about it.
Yeah.
And you can imagine that Michele has a really lovely kind of family setup.
Yeah.
And yes, she might have had these suspicions, but she probably didn't want to rock the boat as such.
Yeah.
Because it would create this tension. But in terms of context, now, after her mum's death, it makes complete sense as to why Alexis is a lot more suspicious of her father.
It all becomes relevant, doesn't it?
Siblings. So, post-death, Martin then pushed for Michele's funeral. And Michele's funeral was actually only 3 days after the autopsy and the death.
The family is still in shock at this point. Like, the daughters are still grieving and trying to come to terms with it, and Martin's already trying to trying to hold the funeral.
But it's also like control over the situation, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like we all may be grieving, but I'm going to decide what's best for the family.
Yeah.
And it's quite kind of matriarchal, but to a real high degree. Like 3 days is extreme.
I think it's really bad, and it's almost like, Martin said it, so he gets his own way.
Yes.
And the funeral did actually go ahead, and he didn't even allow any of Michele's family.
No.
Like, how can you not allow the family to the funeral? He threatened them, saying, if you turn up, I'm going to get you arrested, the police will take you away. Like, how can you actually do that to...
How, but then also why?
Yeah.
Like, why have you got such a hate? Like, they've said that they weren't massively keen on him because he was so overbearing and controlling. But for something like their own family, their own daughter's funeral, why would you not want them there? Like,
No.
It just seems odd. But again, he then exerted control over the funeral, and he actually gave a eulogy, but that was basically about his struggles in life. Talked about having been in the army and how that was a really traumatic time for him. Talked about how this was going to be another real hurdle for him to have to deal with.
How is he making the death of his wife at his wife's funeral about himself?
Yeah.
Like,
how he's going to struggle now. And so made it sound like he'd got, a really tough life, and that he'd been through prior tribulations. But then, again, we have a change in, or a shift in tone, like when they were at the scene, because afterwards, I don't know whether they would call it a wake, but afterwards, he was then joking to people about how he's going to have to get used to bachelor life, and how, I'm a single man now. And it just all
like 3 days after the death is crazy.
Incredibly odd.
Yeah.
And at this stage, again, his mind is basically anywhere other than grief, it seems. Because, again, shortly after, he decided that the family needed a nanny.
Yeah.
And so he created almost like a panel of his family, didn't he?
Yeah.
And I think one of the other daughters, I think it might have been Rachel.
Yeah.
And he basically said, look, we need a nanny. We're going to get a nanny.
We need help looking after the younger children. I can't do it on my own. Let's bring someone in. And he almost set up an interview process, didn't he? Like, as in, these people have applied. Let's interview them.
Yeah.
Which...
odd.
Yeah.
And so they go through with this, and who should appear? Gypsy Gillian Willis.
Alexis at this point was like, you are not letting her be a nanny
she
in
said
the house.
Straight away, I know her.
Yeah.
I know who she is. And she said that her father looked like taken aback.
Yeah.
And she'd said, you're not letting her come in the house. But of course, Martin's not going to listen to her, is she?
Because when Alexis said, so you found a nanny, like, what's the nanny's name? Martin had said, I think it's something like Gillian or Gypsy or something like that, as if he didn't know her. And Alexis were like, no, you know her,
and
I
again,
know her.
When they did that like little interview process, apparently he made it out that he'd never like seen her before, or that she might have looked familiar, but he didn't know her.
Yeah.
But another twist, that woman also looked familiar to everyone else because she had actually been at Michelle's funeral.
This was so shocking, but I watched an interview with Gypsy, and I think it was 2020. Is that a news channel?
Yeah.
An interviewing news channel. Gypsy had sat there, and the interviewer had said to her, so you were at the funeral. Like, why would you go to the funeral? You were having an affair with this man. And she said, no one invited me. And so the interviewer said, so you just crashed a funeral then? And she was like, yeah, well, sort of. But like, I thought Martin might need me. And then the interviewer said to her, well, why did you send him suggestive photos on the day of the funeral? So she turned up and sent him pictures. And Gypsy, obviously, there's maybe something wrong with her at this point, because she had said, I didn't want to lose him. I didn't want the attention to be away from us. Like, obviously, his wife had died and he was with his family and at the funeral. And almost like he wasn't giving her enough attention. So she'd sent him suggestive photos while he's at his wife's funeral.
It's just unbelievable. And again, well, at this point, it's becoming more and more believable based on Martin's behaviour. But just 2 weeks after the death of his wife, Gypsy is now living in the home. And based on the fact that she's meant to be a nanny, all of the family members recalled the fact that she didn't do any cooking, any cleaning. She didn't really look after the kids. She was just now happily moved in with Martin.
And she did say in the interviews that at this point that she would take every opportunity to then have a sexual relationship and sleep with Martin.
Yes.
And I was just like...
Yeah, no.
With her, though, I feel like there was something very sinister about her. When I've watched interviews, I think she was quite a scary person because she was so cold, and even her family had said, like, she's crazy. She could be capable of anything. Like, if she wants something, she will do whatever she can to get it, and she doesn't care about any consequences. And her family were like, she's actually crazy.
Yeah, and the daughters of Michele then went on to call her like the evil stepmom, didn't they? Because she didn't have any interest in building a family relationship. She just wanted Martin, and that's what she got. So if we skip ahead a little bit, sometime later, Alexis, one of the eldest daughters, was actually asked to take her adopted sister back to the Ukraine. And this was, again, at Martin's request, but it was apparently just meant to be for the summer holidays so that she could see a biological family and then come back home.
Yeah, I think it was only due to be like a couple of weeks or something, because she did still have a family there, but she'd come, obviously she'd been adopted to have the better life in America and the better education. But it's nice that she could still go back and spend time with her family.
So because she'd been adopted in the first place, because the living conditions were just difficult, the family didn't have a lot of their own money, Martin was actually meant to be sending out money so that they could afford to basically look after her while she was out there. And so Alexis went, dropped her sister off, basically said, looking forward to catching up with you when you're back. And this poor girl ended up being back in the Ukraine for a year. And she was calling Alexis, obviously, as soon as it's getting like a few weeks in, never mind months in, and crying and saying, my family can't afford to look after me. Martin,
like, bring me back, like, what are you doing?
Martin at this stage had just stopped sending money, and Alexis just couldn't understand why, but equally she didn't have enough control to be able to get her sister back from the Ukraine. Ultimately, she would be returned to Utah and the family, but that whole situation just seemed really odd, and it didn't make any sense as to why Martin would have just sent one of the daughters away. But we'll come back to that. So, Alexis is continuing her own investigation, and unfortunately, years go by and Michelle's death's just been ruled an accident. Martin's continuing with his new, very odd life.
And the police had quickly closed the case at this stage.
Yeah.
Because they thought they'd got the cause of death already, so they've just shut it and sort of carried on. And it's up to the family now, isn't it, to do sort of an independent investigation alongside.
And although Rachel, when everything first occurred and Alexis had mentioned what had happened, or that she suspected that their father was involved, I do think that it caused a real ruckus in their relationship. And because Alexis just wouldn't let it go, Rachel ended up saying that she didn't believe her sister and that she should just put it to bed. And they ended up having a massive rift. And I just feel like that is horrendous, because you would be so torn. You've got the rest of the family there. And then you've got your sister who's fighting for justice ultimately, but losing her family members in the wake of it. But she didn't give up. And eventually, the police did begin investigating Martin MacNeill, and they quickly realised that he had been a liar for a number of years now.
When they dug into it, I was like, oh, this goes way back.
Because just 4 months into their marriage, which was all those years ago, Martin had actually served a 6-month jail sentence for forgery and theft. And that was just 4 months into them being married. So Michele had obviously not mentioned that to anyone, really. And the kids probably had no idea that had ever happened, because it was before any of them were born. But you just think, so he's already got not a tendency as such, but he's already got that streak in him. And then they discovered that, yes, he had been in the army, but he'd actually received medical discharge, and that was because he had been certified as being schizophrenic. So he was receiving 50% of his pension for having served, but was still meant to have basically regular check-ins, wasn't he?
He'd actually claimed the medical allowance for like 30 years or something, and while he was practicing as a physician as well, so I'm guessing he was getting a decent wage from doing that job. And then it turned out it was $3,000 a month he was claiming on top for the army discharge sort of thing, the medical discharge. And you just think, over all them years, like that's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it turned out basically he was a con man.
Yeah, a fraudulent con man.
He's just a fraud, isn't he? From start to finish.
And again, then they dug into why one of his daughters had basically disappeared for a year. And it turns out that the reason for that is because he was actually using his daughter's social security number, had changed it to Gypsy's name, and they were effectively committing identity fraud. And he was then, I got a bit confused, but again, somehow within this committing tax fraud was putting different amounts of money in various bank accounts. And then using this money for Gypsy. Again, they had filed to say that they were married. This marriage was never factual, but the date that they had given on this marriage certificate was the date of Michelle's funeral. And I just thought that was disgusting.
It is, but then like also that's disgusting. But then you've also got your adopted child that is in Ukraine living in awful conditions because you and your new girlfriend want to steal her identity.
And want some more money.
And want
basically.
money. And Gypsy did say in one of the interviews, oh, well, I had a lot of debt and I just wanted to write the debt off and whatever. So you leave a child in those conditions so that you can benefit from it. It's a horrible situation. And it went even deeper into it when they were investigating. Martin's whole life was actually just a fake, because the way he even got into medical school, I think he was on parole when he got into medical school with a fake, what's it called? Like not a recommendation. What was the word now?
Like a reference.
Yeah. So he should have got. He should have got this reference. I can't remember the exact name of it. And instead of getting it, he'd obviously forged it to then get into medical school while he was on parole. So how can this all have happened? But that means his whole career as a doctor is a fake.
Yeah. Probably why he's so defensive about everything.
Yes, I was going to say that,
because he's trying to prove something that he absolutely isn't. But then also just the sheer audacity of them. They both obviously thought that they were going to get away with it. I mean, it is so very obvious that something's going wrong if your daughter's missing for a year.
Yeah.
Everyone's going to question that.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
They didn't care and got away with it for a whole year. Then, obviously, using the date of Michelle's funeral
it's horrible,
on a
isn't
certificate is just like, in your face. But again, then at that point, were they showing off about it? Is that the reason?
It's odd, isn't it?
It just doesn't make sense.
So eventually, they managed to get Elle back from the Ukraine and brought her back over. But it was at this point that everything sort of started to be uncovered, because there was now two people with the same social security number.
Yeah.
So that was Gypsy, who had took Elle's identity, and Elle, who had got her own identity.
Yeah.
So this was quickly uncovered, and they did get arrested for this. So both Gypsy and Martin got arrested.
And in 2009 then, they were sentenced, and Martin received 4 years in prison.
That was for identity theft.
Yeah. Even the FBI were involved in this one, weren't they? And so that was for identity theft. And then again, Gypsy was sentenced, and she got 3 years probation for her part in this whole scheme. Which
I think she was a lot more involved than what she let on in this.
Yeah.
But whilst Martin and Gypsy are in prison, the two detectives who had been assigned the case previously had actually continued their investigations, and they actually convinced the State Medical Examiner's Office to take another look at the toxicology report from Michelle's death, which was key in this, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So by the end of 2009, Alexis then receives an email from the detectives to say, look, we can now confirm that we're going to reopen your mother's case based on the evidence, and that they wanted to get justice for Michele.
Yeah.
So they had a look at the original autopsy, they had a look at the toxicology report, and it quickly became clear that the combination of drugs that Michele had got in her system was huge, and that could have easily caused an overdose.
It was like some crazy cocktail of drugs, wasn't it? It wasn't something that you'd normally prescribe together, and it's definitely something that shouldn't have been taken together. It was I think it was Valium, and I can't remember what the other ones were. There was something that you shouldn't mix.
So the one that was most significant was the Ambien. So Ambien is a sleeping drug. They could see the high quantities of all of these drugs, but crucially, they could actually pinpoint the times in which she would have taken them.
Right.
And what they identified is that she'd taken the Ambien in the morning, which doesn't make any sense, because
that's the sleeping one. So you take that at night to sleep.
Yes. Equally, she wasn't taking any of these drugs at the time. Like, Alexis had left her on basically ibuprofen, and she was all right. And yet she's got all of these really strong drugs in her system. And the final kind of nail in the coffin in terms of the fact that this wasn't accidental was the fact that, based on the amount of drugs within that time frame that she'd have taken them, she would have been that kind of, what's the word? I want to say knocked out. She would have been that delirious.
Yeah.
She couldn't have physically taken those last tablets herself. Someone else would have had to have given them.
And going back to Alexis in this, during this investigation, Alexis had spoke to the police and she'd said another reason why I think my dad's got something to do with it is that my mum had told me that he'd been giving me lots of different medication. And before Alexis had gone back to medical school, she'd actually put the tablets individually, each one, in a mum's hand so that she could feel them. She could feel the shape of them, so she knew which one was which, so she would know if her husband was trying to give her something wrong. Or
can you imagine having to go to those lengths to protect yourself from your own husband?
Yeah. So Alexis had actually managed to start piecing it all together from what her mother had told her beforehand.
It's just crazy to think that you'd have to protect yourself when you're already in such a vulnerable state.
Yeah, so when Martin was actually released from prison after serving just 3 years for the fraud, he sort of returned to the family home and had no idea that investigators were working on putting him back behind bars again. So he's probably come out and knowing what he's like, probably quite cocky, probably quite sarcastic, absolutely. And then not knowing that he's going to go back. And it was
also think that was quite tactical of the whole team.
It was less than 2 months after Martin's release that he was then arrested on $1 million cash bond, facing murder charges in the death of Michele.
Yeah.
So he'd not even been out for 2 months. So
yeah, it was August 24th, 2012. So in 2010, because again, this investigation we're summarising, but stretches over a really long period of time. So by 2010, they created a new autopsy report that stated that it should also include drug intoxication to an extent that Michele couldn't have administered those drugs herself. That then meant that they could continue the investigation into Martin. And so by 2012, that's when, like we've just mentioned, he was then charged with first-degree murder and this ridiculous bail, which I think is, again, brilliant. So we've already got a 2-year stretch just from the new autopsy to then him being charged for the murder. But again, they did mention that this was tactical because they thought that he might incriminate himself. So they were hoping that he'd either speak to Gypsy about something, because he had been so cocksure of himself.
Yeah.
He might then slip up and basically say, like, don't worry, I think we've got away with this or whatever.
Yeah.
That didn't happen. So the case did go to trial, and that was then in October 2013. So the trial then begins, and it went on for quite a while, this trial, but that's because there were so many people involved. So this was a couple of years after his initial arrest, but Alexis then gave a testimony, and she was brilliant. I don't know whether you saw any of the clips.
Yeah.
But when the defence are trying to trip her up, basically, and they're asking her, I think they ask her something about, like, well, did you state that your mother was unconscious? You know, that first time that she'd gone back to the house. And she said, I don't believe I ever said that. I believe that I've just directly answered the questions that have been asked of me. And I was like, oh.
Yeah.
She was so
you know what?
Strong.
I just knew that she was going to be good at this. And you've got to remember, this is years after Michele's murder. It was like 6 years, wasn't it, after?
Yeah.
Which is crazy. And they also put Dr. Scott Thompson on the stand, and he was the plastic surgeon. And they wanted to talk about the medication that he'd prescribed to Michele. And he'd said, look, you know, her husband had said, I'm a doctor, I will be there, I'll be looking after her. Like, he'd sort of covered his back, really, with it, hadn't he, I suppose? But looking back now, obviously, he didn't mean to sort of to kill her, did I? But most of the children in this trial actually did testify against Martin.
And at that point, it came out that Damien, again, one of the sons, in fact, the only son, Martin had ordered Damien or Damien's girlfriend at the time of Michele's death to get rid of all of Michele's medication and then said to keep the plastic surgery a private matter and to not go into any detail about it. So even on the day that Michele had died, he was already covering his tracks. And again, that medical journal that Alexis had kept, she said that it had disappeared. So he completely calculated this whole scenario, really.
And another one that got me is they actually spoke to a woman called Anna, who was Martin's ex-girlfriend.
Yes.
And this must have been from years ago, because he got with Michele when he was really young.
Yeah.
But all the way back then, he used to brag to Anna saying, I could make someone have a heart attack and make it look like natural causes.
Yeah.
Which is...
He's just chilling.
And it's exactly what happened.
Yeah, yeah. So the forensics in this case were absolutely crucial. We've already mentioned that autopsy report and the toxicology report. And what I found really amazing was that first autopsy was really brief. Alexis said they'd not even spelt her mother's name right. It was basically a paragraph.
Yeah.
So for them to be able to get this far forensically based on such brief information from the outset is incredible. So effectively, the events that they believed actually occurred on the day of Michele's death was that Martin went to work at about 9:30 to create his alibi, but then there was a gap in his communications, and that was then until about 11:30, where no one can actually account for his whereabouts. There's no emails being sent, there's no calls. And what they think happened there is that he returned home, which was only like a 5-minute drive away, and that he would have probably said that she needed some more tablets and that he was here to help her, coaxed her or took her into the bath, and at that point held her head under the water. This was significant because they'd actually interviewed inmates of Martin from when he was in for the fraud, and he had actually said to a couple of inmates that is what he'd done. He'd held his wife's head underwater. So again, that aligned with what they then believed had happened.
Yeah.
And so they then believed that he returned to work to again continue his alibi before picking up Ada from like her nursery school and then playing out this whole charade and forcing that poor
That's
child
what I was just going to say. He knew
to go
full
and
well.
find Michelle's body.
He knew full well that Michele was going to be dead in the bath, and he let that little girl go and find her.
It's absolutely horrific.
It's crazy. They also looked at letters because when Martin was in prison, he was still writing to Gypsy as well. So they were still having communication, and I think their letters were also put forward to be analysed.
And Gypsy actually gave a really strong testimony as well, didn't she? She basically confirmed that they were having this affair, that Martin had said he'd do anything for her and that they were in love.
Yeah.
So she made it pretty clear that Martin had a good motive for wanting his wife dead.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the verdict came in. It was really late at night. When the jury had deliberated.
It was actually a 22-day trial.
Yeah, which, again, you can imagine, really.
Yeah, with all this. Yeah.
When it's all added up over all the years. But Martin showed no emotion whatsoever during quite a lot of the trial, really.
They said he was almost like joking with his attorney, and he'd not like... So he showed no remorse for what he did to Michele, but also no respect for his children, who were also in that courtroom.
No. And one of the daughters actually turned to him at one stage and said, "We can't let you get away with this anymore, Dad." And it didn't even look like he felt anything then. He must just have been completely detached. So ultimately, Martin was found guilty. Obviously, the family were relieved and there was an awful lot of emotion in that courtroom. Yeah. But obviously, they're then seeing their dad getting taken away, and Alexis referred to the fact that she could hear the like shackles being put on her dad, and she just said it was horrific. It's traumatizing.
Yeah, because they've already lost the mom, and now they've lost the dad as well, haven't they?
Yeah. So his sentence came several months after the verdict, and he'd actually been obviously held in prison for those months. He'd attempted to take his life in that time, but fortunately was found by prison guards and they saved his life. So then came back from Utah County Jail to be sentenced. And at sentencing, he was really, really gaunt and thin, wasn't he? He'd lost an awful lot of weight. But whether or not that was a calculated decision to hope that the judge would go easy on him because he looked like an older man and he was frail, I don't know. But ultimately, he was sentenced to 15 to life for murder.
I thought that was quite low for
I did as well.
America. We always look at American sentences, and 15 years for murder is something you expect in the UK.
Yeah.
And them to be out in 10.
Yeah.
But in America, I always feel like life is life.
But then a further 1 to 15, and I don't really understand that because that seems
no,
really
I don't really get
vague.
I find the American like judicial system quite hard to get my head around, just because it's different in every state.
And state to state, yeah. So and then a further 1 to 15 for obstruction of justice.
Yeah.
He did appeal that conviction, which again doesn't surprise me in the slightest, really, because again it's that element of control that he's trying to maintain. And then about 10 years after Michelle's death, on April the 9th, Martin did actually take his own life, and that was in 2017. So again, it was around the 10-year mark, and whether or not that was intentional, I would probably say so. Yeah. But Alexis was informed, and I couldn't get over this really, but she actually decided with her 2 older sisters, so Rachel and Vanessa, that they would go and see their father's body for the final time.
Okay.
And they actually went to see his body on 10 years to the day of their mother's murder.
Right.
They were looking at their father's body after he'd committed suicide. And when you just think the whole... I mean, one of those
ordeal
events...
in general is
one
crazy.
of those events alone would be traumatic, but the accumulation of them is just unfathomable.
I feel like the family have done a really good job in trying to keep the mother's memory alive as well. And I did have a look at what they were doing now, because I thought it'd be like a happy note to end on.
Yeah.
So Alexis did go on to become a doctor, and she got married.
Yeah.
She successfully adopted her little sisters, Ada, Sabrina and Elle.
Amazing.
She had another 3 children of her own. She changed her last name to her mother's maiden name because she didn't want to get her doctorate in her dad's name. She didn't want to be Dr. MacNeill. She wanted to be Dr. Summers, which I thought was quite nice.
Yeah.
Some of the children have children of their own as well. They removed Martin's name from their mother's gravestone and sanded off the words "wife of Martin." And I just thought that it's nice to know that they are actually doing well.
And Rachel and Alexis obviously then rekindled their relationship, which is really...
So the family relationships survived this as well.
Yeah.
So
unfortunately, I should have said it before, you finished on a high. Gypsy was never charged.
No, she
with
wasn't.
Anything.
I was so surprised by
connection.
This. Yeah.
And has then since gone on to make probably quite a lot of money from all these interviews that was referenced. And if you go and watch some of those, she does just seem really
there is
far
no
removed
emotion.
from
There's nothing.
reality.
It is so strange to watch.
And she's just done so many interviews. You think you come out like the bad guy, and yet you just
shouldn't care, does she?
No,
she actually doesn't care. But
so
anyway, we're not ending on a high anymore because
Sorry,
Beth's just done it on a downer. I'm only joking. So that was our case study for today, and we've only got one more case study left now.
I know.
One case study and then a final episode for you all.
Yes, just for season 1.
Yeah, just for season 1, but don't worry, we will be back.
Yeah.
You're not getting rid of us that easy. So for now, we will see you next week.
Take
Bye.
care.